Okay, I think we can get started, and I want to thank you all for coming out in this this lovely weather we're having. Finally, having a bit of a fall experience, or wintry mix, I think is what they call it now. But in any case, thanks for coming, and also for all those who are online. Thank you for joining us there, and probably would have been for those of you who have to travel long distance, might have been a wise choice in given the weather conditions. But in any case, we're very pleased to be able to present this. Have this opportunity to present these findings. The TOPS program has been very much involved in resilience from the very beginning. As many of you, I think, probably were also present at just about 3 years ago, and this time in 2011, when USAID sponsored a 2-day conference on resilience, and the Food for Peace asked the TOPS program to be intricately involved in the design and setup of that, so that make sure that as many of the practitioners, people in the PVO community, as well as the other stakeholders in the community of practice, are involved in the discussion about resilience that led eventually, a little bit later that same year, into the promulgation of USAID's resilience policy. We and our partners, that's Save the Children, who is the prime on the TOPS program, and Food for the Hungry, the core group, Tango International, and Mercy Corps, have all been very much involved in resilience, and some of the leaders in the resilience conversation are in the room here today, and we welcome you all. The Tango International is a member of the TOPS consortium, and they have been conducting the evaluation that's going to be presented to you today. It's the first opportunity we've had since these kinds of conversations had begun, to actually look at how to measure resilience. That was a topic of conversation in many of the sessions in the 2011 conference that was held. Is how do you measure resilience? What is it? Was it? I know what it looks like, but how do you measure it? And so this has been a very keen subject of conversation and research now for several years. And this is an opportunity now to see some results being presented in the form of measurement of resilience indicators. And for that, I think we can all learn as we move forward into this in this world of resilience. Particularly, I think it's of particular importance because as we speak, and for the next several months, the Office of Food for Peace at USAID is also developing its new global strategy, and we hope that lessons learned from this kind of activity and the kinds of things that the implementing community, the donor community, and so on are engaged in that look to resilience as a characteristic of the kind of development we want to see evolve. We'll carry those lessons into the design and the structure of the new Food for Peace strategy, for example. So in that case, in any case, thank you all for coming. We look forward to your comments and your questions, and I'd like to pass this on to Tim Frankenberger, President and CEO of Tango International, and Greg Collins, who's also here, who's one of Greg Collins, right. But in any case, Greg and Tim are going to be presenting here today, and which one of you wants to go first? Okay, I'll let you go first.
So actually, it'll be Tim presenting. I'm just going to give a few opening remarks to sort of position this effort in relation to the broader work of USAID. And I think, as Mark alluded to, one of the fundamental things about measurement is it actually helps clarify what we're talking about with resilience. I remember, if I think back to the initial debates around measurement, it was an argument about what's the right outcome measure. Should we measure it through poverty, nutrition, some combination, maybe an index of outcomes? And then there was a progression of that debate, and we really sort of collectively, not only USAID, but a bunch of different partners as part of a technical working group, came to the collective conclusion that what we're really talking about with resilience is a set of capacities, and that we need to move away from arguing over what's the right outcome measure and understand resilience as a set of capacities realized in relation to shocks and stresses and indexed against a set of outcomes of interest. Those may vary by organization. For USAID, we're particularly interested in poverty, nutrition measures, but let's not debate over what's the right outcome. Let's agree upon measuring resilience as a set of capacities and then go about the business of exploring how to do that together. And I think one of the important things to make clear here is this is not a definitive statement on how to. this is an example of one attempt to explore that space about measuring resilience as a set of capacities. And I think it's a very good one. I think also what's a fundamental point to make is that that set of capacity actually exists at multiple levels. So USAID's rather lengthy definition of resilience attempts to specify that resilience as the capacity of people, households, communities, and systems to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shocks and stressors in a manner that reduces chronic vulnerability and facilitates inclusive growth. So within that very lengthy definition, we have the specification of resilience as a set of capacities, which is a lot what Tim's going to be talking about today. I think the other thing to point out here is that this particular survey work is actually informing how we're approaching measurement in the Sahel, how we're approaching it in an increasing number of cases where USAID is making focused resilience efforts. And what's key to this measurement, it really speaks to what's different. This isn't just about doing development work in places we used to treat as perpetual humanitarian risk. It's about building up this set of capacities, yes, to achieve certain thresholds related to outcomes, but we're actually focused on building those capacities, and as will be explored here, really looking at how we measure and capture how those capacities are being built. The other thing about measuring capacities that I think is interesting is it actually allows us to measure resilience in the event it isn't being tested. So we have some measures of capacities, even when there's not a shock or stress, that give us some sort of intermediate measure of we're making progress on this front. So I think without too much ado, I'll pass to Tim. I would say this is a USAID evaluation, but it's actually informing a much broader community of practice. Tim and I are involved in something called the FSIN Technical Working Group on Resilience Measurement, and this is one of the seminal pieces that's informing that work. So with that, Tim, I'll pass to you.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here to present this work. Those of you who have worked in the pastoral areas of both the Sahel or Ethiopia will know sometimes it's very difficult to collect information from these populations, and we're lucky that nobody was shot or one of our vehicles wasn't confiscated. But what I wanted to also say was that this study was funded under the U.S. Feed the Future Feedback Project, which Westat is the lead on, and Tango is one of the partners of that group. And so the work that we've been doing through feedback is to really support the Bureau of Food Security in trying to improve measurement, trying to capture impact for many of the Feed the Future projects that are out there. The other thing I want to say is that we have one of the designers of the PRIME project actually in the audience, so he's going to keep me honest in anything I might say about the project that might be twisted a little bit. So one of the things about this area is that pastoral Ethiopia is one of the most shock-prone places in the world. So what better place to try to test measuring resilience than in a very shock-prone area? This pastoral zone, in which the PRIME project interventions are located, this is the Somali region, the Borana region, the Afar region, are characterized by very high mean temperatures, erratic and unpredictable rainfall, very patchy vegetation. So if you've been in those areas, you know it's a very tough place to try to eke out a living. These pastoral systems are under increasing pressure due to natural and man-made shocks that are leading to imbalances between the population and resources that depend to sustain them. So even though pastoralism is something that can adapt to different kinds of changes that are occurring, when you start restricting that movement, it makes it more difficult for people to adapt. And so as a result of a number of different factors, it's becoming more and more difficult for these pastoral groups to be resilient to the shocks that they're exposed to. The areas where this project is focused are in the red, and where the baseline that we did occurred was in this region and in this region. We didn't go into the Afar region, and I'll explain why in a minute. The ongoing climate change is expected to increase unpredictability of rainfall, leading to more frequent droughts and floods. What was interesting about this area is that people were talking about not only being constantly exposed to drought, but also being constantly exposed to floods in the same areas. And so even if they weren't hit by the drought, they were hit by a flood. And so and those are connected to each other. If you lose all your vegetation in an area, water runs faster down the gullies and can wipe out areas very quickly. The natural resource base is degrading due to overgrazing, increased sedentization for farming, and increased presence of agriculture, which is, as I said before, is limiting the mobility of these pastoralists to be able to move as a major risk management strategy. And also there is poor access to financial services such as savings and credit, which reduces their ability to cope with shocks. And this is something that the project is trying to actually address. So the other problem that this area has is that it has very fragmented markets, both for input and supply services, and underdevelopment of output markets. So even if you wanted to diversify into different kinds of livelihood strategies, it's difficult because the markets just aren't very well developed. An additional challenge is that the increased competition for pasture and water has led to conflict in a number of these locations, and we personally, as we were carrying out this survey, experienced a lot of this conflict in the areas where our survey teams were actually shot at, or our drivers were thrown in jail or confiscated vehicles, the whole 9 yards. So one of the things about this pastoral area resilience improvement through market expansion project, or PRIME, first it's a USAID Ethiopia Feed the Future project. It's implemented, its main implementer is Mercy Corps with support from CARE, Cometrica, Haramaya University, Pastoral Concern, Aged and Children's Pastoral Association, and SOS, Sahel, Ethiopia. It has three major objectives. One is to try to increase household incomes. The other one is to enhance resilience to shocks and stresses, and to bolster the adaptive capacity to climate change. So it's working in 23 wards within 3 pastoral clusters. As I said, the Borana area, the Somali area, and the Afar region. And what they're trying to do in this project is they're trying to foster the competitiveness of livestock value chains to address the needs of the very poor and chronically food insecure. Through this value chain interventions, they're trying to also improve the policy environment, the delivery of health services, and bring about behavioral change for positive nutritional outcomes. As Greg already pointed out, the evaluation conceptualizes resilience using these two types of definitions. One is, as Greg said, the ability of people, households, communities, and countries and systems to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shocks and stresses in a manner that reduces chronic vulnerability and facilitates inclusive growth. The important thing here is that we are trying to improve resilience at multiple scales, at individual level, at household level, at community level, and at systems level. Second thing is that we're interested in capacity. So the second definition from the Resilience Technical Working Group gives emphasis to this. Resilience is defined as a capacity that ensures stressors and shocks do not have long-lasting adverse development consequences. So when we view resilience as a set of capacities, we're interested in how those set of capacities enable households and communities to function in the face of shocks and stresses and still meet their well-being outcome measures. So what we had to do as part of this survey is make sure that we had good measures of shocks and stresses, we had to have good measures of these capacities, and we had to have good measures of these outcomes that we were trying to see, whether or not these capacities actually did have a positive influence on people's outcomes. There are three types of capacities that are important that we're interested in. One is absorptive capacity. This is, if you were to think about it in the short term, can people, households, systems absorb shocks in the short term without losing their ability to function, and can they make sure that they don't have long-term negative effects as they adapt to those shocks and stresses? So a lot of the disaster risk reduction work that you have been engaged in, those of you that are engaged in emergency work or with OPTA, that's primarily where you've been focused, is on this disaster risk reduction work that forms the basis of absorptive capacity. Adaptive capacity is making proactive and informed choices about alternative livelihood strategies based on an understanding of changing conditions. this is, you know that climate change is for real. You know that the economic situation is changing dramatically. You are adapting to that in such a way that you're still able to meet your needs effectively. So that might change your livelihood strategies. It might allow you to diversify. It may have you actually have people go off to other places that are not exposed to the same kinds of risk profiles, so that you can make a living and send remittances back to your households. All of this is part of adapting. And so a lot of this adaptive strategy work is coming out of the climate change work that people are engaged in. Transformative capacity is the enabling conditions, the systems-wide stuff, the governance that needs to be in place, the policies, the regulations, the infrastructure, the community networks, the formal and informal social protection mechanisms that constitute the enabling environment for systemic change. Transformative capacity is something we normally think of being what development agents do. They are engaged more in trying to make sure that governments are able to deliver services, that current policies don't penalize the poor that we're trying to work with, that there are markets that are functioning so that people can actually get access to resources and goods and services. It's the enabling conditions that have to be in place. So in some places where we have protracted crisis, parts of Ethiopia, Somalia, you name it, there's a number of them in East Africa, we don't have good transformative capacity in place. And so even if we strengthen absorptive and adaptive capacity, without that transformative capacity, it's quite likely that whatever we work on will not be sustained. So all three of these capacities are critical. They're important. We need to look for how we're strengthening them or where the weaknesses are in these different kinds of capacities so that we can build resilience in these areas. So the overall objective of this study was to determine the impact of the project interventions on household resilience to shocks, and thus on well-being outcomes, including poverty, food security, and children's nutritional status. Now, this was a baseline, so we're going to do an end line, and we're also doing an interim monitoring surveys as well to kind of check to see how the project is doing on allowing people to manage shocks and stresses more effectively. What's important here is that when you do the baseline, you want to know, are there differences already within the populations? We have three types of livelihood strategies in these two areas. We have pastoralists, we have agro-pastoralists, and we have non-pastoralists living in these areas. We want to know if there are big differences between these groups in terms of access to resources, livelihood strategies, access to social capital, et cetera, so that we can take that into account when we look at the end line and see if there are already these big differences, did the project bring about the kind of changes that we hoped for? We also are looking at differences between the regions. So in the Somali region, you've got different ethnic group than you do in the Borana region. We want to see if there are major differences in resilience capacity already in those two regions. So the baseline survey analysis in this report had four objectives. One, we wanted to understand the livelihood environment in which household resilience is determined in the evaluation areas. We wanted to provide baseline estimates of indicators of household well-being outcomes, shock exposure, and resilience capacities. We wanted to explore the differences across the IU comparison groups that will be used to measure prime project impact at the time of the end-line survey, and to investigate the relationship between household outcomes, shock exposure, and resilience capacities. So those were the four objectives of this baseline survey. The survey was administered from November 19th to December 24th, 2013, in two of the three subregions of the prime project area. We were encouraged by USAID Ethiopia to select two of the, not to work on all three because of the cost implications, but also because they wanted to make it basically a dual-focused IE. They wanted to see where they were focusing on strengthening natural resource management. Did that make a big difference in improving resilience versus where they were trying to really strengthen market enabling conditions? So even though there's still strengthening markets in both regions, there is a stronger emphasis on natural resource management in the Borana region. So we had two essential instruments that were used for the quantitative survey. We had a household survey instrument and a community survey. Those of you who would like access to these instruments, the prime baseline volume 1 and volume 2 will be available in the next day or two, so you can actually have access to these things. We also carried out qualitative research at the same time. So this was very much a mixed method approach. where we did focus groups, key informant interviews, and we also tried to identify households that were considered positive deviants by villagers in the area. These were households that actually people would say, that household is very good at adapting to shocks and stresses. Why don't you go ask them what they do? And so we had several of those kinds of households that we interviewed. There were 3,142 households surveyed in total in 75 communities. It was stratified by the Barana and the Jijiga region, and high-intensity, low-intensity intervention areas. So to capture a counterfactual, we were trying to see if those places where we had more interventions, higher intensity of interventions, are those the places that we saw stronger resilience being built in places where you had very low intensity of interventions. So that's how we differentiated the two types of areas. The project itself knew where they were going to work. They knew where they were going to concentrate certain activities in certain cabales. So we were able to select out those areas for that purpose. One of the things that we tried to do, because we're going to be using propensity score matching to match up the households, is that we needed to oversample in the low intensity areas to make sure that we had enough common characteristics between households that would allow us to make those kinds of comparisons. The qualitative component of data collection focused on capturing contextual information about resilience and the impact of shocks in order to understand and explain these outcomes. If you read the report, which is quite long, I apologize for how long it is, but it's rich in the sense that the qualitative data really brings out what people say they're doing in response to these shocks and stresses, what's important about this environment that they live in. And these are so important in trying to understand the actual quantitative statistics that are being generated. So I encourage you to always do a mixed method approach when you're doing these evaluations because they both contribute so much to our understanding. The qualitative findings also help us explain how household communities perceive change. So one set of villages were basically saying that, you know, drought is so common around here, we don't even think of it as a shock anymore. You know, the real shock for us are these floods. But the floods are related to these shocks, these droughts. And so, but, you know, that's important for people to understand is that if something, and this is something we found similar in Niger when we did this work for CRS, was that people wouldn't acknowledge the droughts, even though by all of our objective measures, rainfall patterns had changed dramatically. They just didn't see it as a shock anymore because they had become used to it. So it's also important to understand how people themselves define resilience and what they view as a challenge for being able to achieve resilience, because that's going to give you insights about what they will actually want to do in terms of interventions to change that situation. So we had a number of, on our topical outlines that we used in our focus group discussions, we looked at coping strategies, we looked at issues around social capital, aspirations, to provide us some in-depth knowledge about what households and communities' resources to manage shocks are. And I'll come back to that in a second because we're very interested in tracking that as well in the monitoring system that we've set up. So the quantitative resilience measurement of the prime IE had two primary objectives. One was to create valid measures of resilience of the three dimensions, its absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacity that are solidly aligned with the definitions of these concepts. So we needed, those of you who've been following what we've been doing over the last couple of years, we were trying to get the theoretical piece right and then see what that actually translates to into actual surveys. So these conceptual papers that we've been developing with the FSIN really tried to get the theory behind the measurement so that when we actually did the measurement, we actually kind of knew what we were doing. You know, it's all still new. But the theory does support the practice. We also needed to create valid measures of shock exposure and food security outcomes. And one of the things that the Food Security Information Network is discovering is that even though we know that measuring shocks are important, we don't really have really good modules for that purpose. And so we were, in this study, we attempted to try to do a better job on measuring these shocks and stresses. And so hopefully that will be useful for people to look at. So the approach that we used essentially followed the common analytical framework model for resilience measurement that was proposed in the first FSIN paper that came out, Consis, Frankenberger, and Hodnott, 2014. So the baseline combines data on resilience capacity, shocks, and outcomes in an integrated framework for resilience measurement so that measures of resilience can be used to assess how resilience capacities mediate the consequences of shocks to enable the achievement of well-being. So these capacities, what's important here is that the capacities mediate the shocks and stresses. So when we're measuring shock, this is when our first task was trying to determine how we measure shock. So it should be sensitive to the specific types of shocks or stressors that are seen threatening a given development outcome. So there's a necessity for highly detailed technical sound shock modules that's central to resilience measurement. If you don't get the measurement of shock right, you won't really know whether or not you're capturing resilience. So we started with a shock module containing questions about whether respondents had experienced 18 different shocks. We just didn't make these up. This was actually coming from a number of other studies in the past in the area, and these were the kinds of shocks that were identified by populations there. So these shocks included climate shocks, conflict shocks, economic shocks, animal diseases, access to inputs and access to markets. All of these things are part of the module. Then we asked each of the respondents to rank the severity of each shock experienced. So how severe was the impact on your income and food consumption? So it could say none, slight impact, moderate impact, strong impact, worse than ever. So what's important here is that 87% of the households of the 3,100 and so interviewed, all were experiencing shocks, 87% of them. And most common shocks were sharp food price increases, livestock and crop disease, drought, bad harvests, and increase in the price of livestock and agricultural inputs. So the most common type of conflict shock was theft of livestock. So this area, this is an area that, similar to the Somalia, you have clans that are fighting between each other, raiding each other. You have ethnic groups fighting, Oromo fighting Somalis. There's a whole bunch of different fighting going on between different groups. And a lot of it is cattle raiding, a lot of it is fighting over water access, fighting over pasture access, and particularly as the drought increases in these areas, the competition goes up dramatically. And so water was probably the most important issue that people identified as where a lot of the conflict actually was about. So some people have projected that water is going to be the big problem in the future. It's already there. It's already here. Okay, so to measure the overall degree of shock exposure for each household, we created an index. And so this was to take not only the number of shocks exposed, but perceived severity of the shocks. What's important here is that people experience multiple shocks. They don't experience only one shock. And a lot of the work in the past has only focused on one or two shocks and not really seen how the combination of shocks actually influences people. Also, they haven't really factored in the severity of the shock. So what we've tried to do then was essentially create a shock exposure index that allowed you to not only take how many shocks people are exposed to, but how severe those shocks were, and then we can calculate an index. So that can really tell you how bad off this household is with regards to these shocks. The second thing we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure that we had good well-being indicators. And so we focused a lot on the food security indicators because this is one of the primary focus of the PRIME IE. So we measured it using two types of indicators, those based on reports of food consumption and those reflecting respondents' perceptions and experience with food insecurity. So the consumption indicators are per capita caloric consumption. So we did have a large module on all of the foods people purchased and consumed. And we also did a diet diversity index. So the per capita calorie consumption is the total calorie content of the food consumed by household members daily divided by household size, the indicator of the quantity of the food consumed by the household members. And this diet diversity reflects the quality of household diets and the total number of food groups out of 12 which the household members consumed. We were also interested in experiential indicators of household food security. And so one of the creators of this index is sitting here on the front row, Ann Swindale. this is the Household Food Insecurity Access Scale. Also, the Household Hunger Scale, both of which, one's derived from the other. So we were interested in looking at 9 types of questions regarding people's experience of food insecurity. And these responses ranged anywhere from worrying about it to not having enough food to actual experiences of food deprivation associated with hunger. So these are, all of you who have been engaged in food security for a long time pretty much know how to measure these things, so I'm not going to go into more detail about it. But so we had these 4 sets of indicators that we were looking at. Before I go on, we also were measuring nutritional outcomes as well as poverty outcomes. And what was interesting about this study was we did both an income poverty measure as well as an asset poverty measure. And what we believe is with pastoral groups in Ethiopia, it makes more sense to look at assets than it does income. And that's because people have all of their wealth tied up in their animals and are trying to, so those with greater assets are able to manage more effectively than, if you're not near a market and you don't have other alternative income sources, income poverty doesn't make a lot of sense for comparison to some of these groups. We looked at both of them, but I'm just throwing that out as that asset poverty would seem to be a more effective measure here. The other thing that we looked at was nutritional status, and one of the problems we had with this group is that people in this region didn't know how old their kids were. And you need to know how old your kid is to be able to do stunting measures properly. So they would make these wild guesses. And so when we looked at the data closely, it tended to stack around 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, and that doesn't help you to do proper stunting analysis. What they couldn't lie about, though, was weight for height, or height for weight. You know, so there we had accurate measures, and so we feel that wasting is probably a better indicator among these pastoral groups to be looking at. Studies that have been done by FuseNet in northern Kenya also support that position, that you don't see a lot of stunting among tall pastoral groups, but you see a lot of wasting. And in fact, in this area, 14% of the population was wasted. So wasting was a serious issue in this area, and so we think that that was a good measure to look at. In terms of capacities, as I said before, resilience is a set of capacities that enables households and communities to effectively function in the face of shocks and stresses and still meet their well-being outcomes. So we were trying to create indices for each of these 3 types of dimensions: the absorptive capacity, adaptive capacity, and transformative capacity. And then we created an overall index that combined all 3. And we don't recommend doing that all the time, and the reason is it doesn't really tell you what to do. If you just look at one big index, yeah, it'll tell you this group is more resilient than that group, but it won't. If they're not more resilient, what do you do about it? You need to disaggregate this information so that you know, well, they can't absorb shocks very well, so maybe we should focus more on disaster risk reduction. Or they can't adapt very well, so maybe we should look at livelihood diversification. Or the enabling conditions are so bad in this area. They don't have good access to social services. The policies suck in terms of market access. So it's important to disaggregate this information so that you can figure out what you should be doing or how your interventions should be focused. You probably can't read that, but these are all the indicators that were used to create these different capacity indices. And again, I'll share with you the documents that go into more detail about how we measured each of these things. And in fact, we realized that this was a very complicated survey. And we don't recommend everybody do it this way. But what we found is that we had to go complex to figure out what we could eliminate. And so we've done some reanalysis of all this data, and we've cut it down to 4 indicators for each one now. That we don't lose too much predictive power when we can get to these 4. And I'll share that with you later if you want to know what those are. But again, each of these indicators, it wasn't just willy-nilly that we put them into this. There was theoretical basis for every one of these being under each of these. So, and we go into minute detail as to why we chose this indicator for what purpose. So each of these capacities are not mutually exclusive. Some of the indicators are used to measure more than one capacity. So, for example, social capital is in all three dimensions, but different types of social capital. So how many of you are familiar with Daniel Aldridge's book on social capital and disaster management? Don't hold your hands up at once. Okay. There are three types of social capital that are important. One is what we call bonding social capital. So that's like if this group was a community and we all shared helping each other out, either working on each other's farms, loaning each other food, taking care of each other's kids. That's bonding social capital. Bridging social capital is where you have a connection to another community, where I have relatives that might live in another community that's not exposed to the same risk profiles that I'm exposed to. So I call on my uncle over there and say, hey, we didn't get any rain over here. Can you send some money or some cattle over to help us out to get through this bad time? So that bridging social capital is important, both in terms, so a Somali living in Somali region might be able to call on a relative living in Minnesota to send money back. That's bridging social capital. Linking social capital is where you have connections to power at vertical levels. So this could be, maybe you're well connected to care, and so you can get care to come down and help you out when you need them to, or you're connected to the regional government somehow, and so the regional government can provide a social safety net when you need it. Linking social capital is the relationship that you have with powers that control resources above you. So as you can imagine, if a drought hits your area and you need some assistance right away, if you have good connections with people in the government control who gets the social protection activities, that's a good thing, because then your community gets it before somebody else does. Okay, so all three of these types of social capital are important, and they all fit into resilience. And so, so if we think about social capital as the quality and quantity of social resources, I'm not going to go into all of the definitions. If you really want to know about this stuff, there are plenty of, we wrote about it back in the 90s. But the important thing is that this is an important concept. You're not going to be able to get at it easily through quantitative measures. You also need to rely a lot on qualitative measures to really understand how it works. But it's critical for any measurement of resilience. So when we try to then look at these different types of capacity, absorptive capacity is essentially the ability to minimize the extent of exposure to shocks and stresses before they happen, and to recover quickly when exposed, after they happen. So it's not only being able to protect yourself, but it's being able to recover. Can be thought of as the ability to manage shocks and stressors in the short term. So the index of absorptive capacity is composed of an experiential indicator of perceived ability of households to recover from shocks. That's one of the major indicators in this index. And so we're not only interested in the exposure of shocks people have, but do they really believe they can manage it? Do they believe in themselves that they are able to overcome it, to move on? And that confidence to manage the shock is a really important part of resilience. These social psychological factors, you'll see this throughout my presentation. They become an essential part of understanding resilience. So we have created another very complicated index on how to capture that. I'm not going to go into that right now. If you are interested, you can see it in the report. But we also, in this index, we wanted to look at other factors that assist households in minimizing the extent of exposure to shocks. So again, bonding social capital is really important. Access to informal safety nets, supportive economic factors like how much assets and cash savings you have, health, hazard insurance. Some of these communities did have hazard insurance, and the availability of disaster preparedness and mitigation programs. So trying to capture all the things that allow you to not only protect yourself, but recover in the face of shocks and stresses. So when we look at these things, I'm not going to go into all these numbers, but again, here are the various types of indicators that go into the index. Perceived ability to recover from shock, bonding social capital, access to informal safety nets, asset ownership, holdings of cash savings, availability of hazard insurance, and availability of disaster preparedness and mitigation. Several of these things are things that the project itself is trying to improve upon. And so we want to track this over time to see if these numbers actually get better as a result of the project. Adaptive capacity involves making more proactive, informed choices of alternative livelihood strategies based on changed conditions. So households with strong adaptive capacity are able to respond flexibly to long-term social and economic environmental change. And so to measure adaptive capacity, we start with an experiential indicator describing households' aspirations and confidence to adapt to change. So again, here's this social psychological factor that's important. We found in a study that we did in 2007 that aspirations really are key to people's ability to adapt or adopt new technologies or to manage the shocks and stresses that they were exposed to. So we're interested in understanding these aspirations more in detail. I'll come back to that. So this index also looked at human capital. This is the amount of education that people had. Did they rely on certain kinds of training that enabled them to diversify more effectively? What kinds of bridging and linking social capital did they bring into play? What kinds of economic capital, including diversity of livelihoods? What kinds of access to financial services and asset ownership again? Now, what's important here is that, and Greg and I have gone into this in detail in some of our discussions, it's not so important that people have diversity of livelihoods, because you could have many things that you're doing, but you're exposed to the same kinds of risk. So if you have a drought, it doesn't matter how much you diversify in ag value-added activities, you're still going to be negatively affected by the drought. Okay, so one of the things you need to think about is, are you diversified in livelihood activities that are not exposed to the same risk profiles? Okay, so if a drought hits, this activity I'm engaged in is not going to be affected by that drought. Okay, so this is the stuff that we're trying to capture better in the measurement. We didn't do it as good in this job as we could have, and so hopefully in the next iterations of this that we do in other countries, we are better at it. But, you know, I think that there's been a lot of thinking around this, and I think it's actually going to be an important forward movement in terms of looking at livelihood diversification. So household aspirations and confidence to adapt. Okay, this self-esteem and agency are important traits that are hypothesized to give people greater resilience in the face of shocks. So this is, you know, in some of these places where we work, there's a lot of fatalism. People think, well, it's up to God. I don't have any control over this, or I don't have any individual power to enact change as an individual. I'm just subject to the decisions of more powerful people. I just do what other people tell me to do, or I don't have any other exposure to how things can be done differently because I never go anywhere. I've been in the same village forever, and I don't know that 50 miles away, people already figured out how to manage this more effectively. So what's important is that we're trying to measure these aspirations and confidence to adapt in an index, and then we look to see how effective that is on these outcomes that we're interested in. Again, it has a big role to play, these aspirations and confidence to adapt. And so what I'm trying to say is, you hardcore economists out there that kind of play down the importance of psychological factors, it's really important in our understanding of resilience. So again, these are the different indicators that are used in constructing this index. So transformative capacity, the third type of capacity, relates to the governance mechanisms, the policies, the regulations, the infrastructure, the community networks, the formal safety nets that are part of the wider system out there. Okay, so these are systems-level changes that enable more lasting resilience. Okay, so we're always, NGOs don't always have control over some of these systemic changes, but they can partner with organizations that actually do. And so we need to work closely with government to bring about these kinds of changes in services, the changes in formal safety nets, how policy affects people that are working in this area, how governance affects people working in this area. All of these things are very important to understanding transformative capacities. So one of the things this project is trying to do is it's really trying to improve market support services. It's trying to ensure that people's access to markets and the various kinds of services required to make those markets function are strengthened, that the infrastructure is strengthened, that other basic services are being provided, that livestock services like vet services and access to inputs like vaccines are there, that better communal natural resource management is happening so that people aren't degrading the environment, that they have access to pasture and water, and they are doing it in such a way that they aren't creating conflict with communities nearby. All of this is more systems-wide, more systemic, and needs to be part of what you're doing in terms of building resilience. So again, when I was talking about the different levels, it's important to understand that you have to work at the individual level on psychosocial support. You have to work at the household level in terms of assets and access to livelihood strategies and human capital and things like that. You have to work at the community level to try to make sure that people have collective action that actually contributes to the positive well-being of people living in those areas. And you got to make sure that the systems are functioning properly. All four of those levels are part of what you have to engage in to build resilience. So when we look at a lot of the indicators that are used in this index come from the community questionnaire. Okay, so we needed to find out what kinds of access to services people did have, what kinds of infrastructure, where are the markets, what kinds of information do people get, and where does it come from? Do they have an early warning system that operates in that area already that people can rely on? All those kinds of things. So this is what kind of feeds into this construction of this index. So, okay, we've created a lot of indices. Now we want to know what does this all mean? Okay, so first of all, we wanted to know, are there any differences across these key populations of interest? So you have the people living in the Somali region near Jijiga, and you have the people living in Borana. Are there any differences in people's access to, or exposure to shocks? Any differences in terms of these well-being outcome indicators? Are there any differences in people's capacities? Are there differences between pastoral groups, agro-pastoral groups, and non-pastoralists, and all these different kinds of indicators? Are there differences between places, those Cabeles where there's low-intensity interventions versus those that are high-intensity? So we looked at all of these different comparison groups to see if there were differences. That's very important at the beginning of your baseline to make sure you understand where people are coming from so that you can interpret the end line better. If you don't recognize there's already a lot of differences out there, it's not homogeneous, it's very heterogeneous out there, then you may misinterpret your findings when you do the end line. So it's important to kind of get the current status of where people are so you can know where they're going. So in the future, data will be used for looking at how resilience capacity, shock exposure, and food security change over the course of the project between the baseline and endline surveys. We're using panel data. So that's, those of you who do surveys for a living know how difficult it is to do panel data with pastoral groups. So you have to recognize that we're going to lose some people. Some people are going to migrate out of the area. So we needed to oversample by 20% to make sure that we capture enough households to allow us to make the kinds of comparisons in the end. So this panel data is really important for tracking real change within a household over time. So not only are we using panel data between the baseline and the end line, but we're also using panel data to monitor over time. So we're tracking a subset of households over the next 2 years to see how they're doing in actually managing change. So we can have real-time measure of whether people are coping effectively or not. So that's what this monitoring survey is all about. Okay, so now for the fun stuff. Okay, so we're doing a lot of multivariate analysis to investigate the structural relationships between what we're hypothesized to exist between household food security, shock exposure, and resilience capacity. Specifically, we wanted to answer these three questions. How is household food security affected by household resilience capacities, including overall resilience capacity in its three dimensions? How is household food security affected by household shock exposure? And does greater resilience capacity reduce the negative impact of shocks on food security? If it's a true mediating factor, it should, even though you've increased the number of shocks and stresses people are exposed to, you should see it buffering people in terms of being able to achieve the outcomes we're hoping for, if our hypotheses are correct. And we've chosen the right indicators. Right? Okay, so we wanted to also try to make sure that we invest these questions using community fifth effects regression models. And why do we do that? Well, because the community of residents of each household is controlled for, and thus factors at the community level that influence each dependent variable can be taken into account. Additionally, we wanted to also control for the number of household adult equivalents, the percentage of female and males in 3 age groups, the educational attainment of the household adults, whether the household is female, adult-only household, the pastoral status of the household, and the asset index to control for household wealth. Okay, so to determine how a household food security and child nutrition are affected by household shock exposure, we use the following equation. So the household outcome, whether it be food security or wasting or some income measure, is affected, the function of shock exposure index and the household characteristics, controlling for household demographic characteristics like the things I just mentioned, and the community of residents. So the community fixed effects allows us to control for the factors of community level that influence outcome variables. And then for the determining whether the well-being outcomes affected by households of community resilience capacity, we use the following equation. So we're interested in household resilience capacity, whether that's influencing these outcomes, and community resilience capacity, whether that's influencing these outcomes. Now, the way that we measure community resilience was we used a number of indicators that helped us capture what we call collective action. Okay, so we felt that when you see 5 types of collective action and they're strong, then you're going to have more community resilience. One of those is informal safety nets, where they actually help each other out. Okay, that's one type of collective action. Another type of collective action is disaster risk reduction activities, where people actually help each other build dikes and other ways of managing shocks in their area. A third type of collective action are natural resource management. So are they actually managing the pastures and water that they're exposed to? A fourth type of collective action was conflict mitigation. Were they able to actually work with other communities that they're fighting with to actually work out deals where they don't shoot each other when they're trying to graze their animals or trying to water their animals? And then the fifth type of collective action is, do they take care of the public goods that they actually have in their community? So these public goods are like roads, they're schools, they're clinics, they're water systems, things that are, there are things that that community has to take care of. These public goods are not individually owned. Okay, so we're interested in how they do in managing these different types of collective action, and if they have a very strong collective action in these areas, they're more likely to have more community resilience. If they're weak in these areas, they're probably less likely to have strong community resilience. Now, before I give you the results, I want to also point out that in these communities where we're working in, collective action is not very strong on some things. And so it didn't have as a big impact as we hoped it would, as we hypothesized it would. Now, one of the things that's important here is it still had an impact, but we feel that the project itself needs to really build more strength in these areas. And in fact, the project is focused on trying to improve the natural resource management, trying to reduce conflict, trying to do more disaster risk reduction, So the project is focused on many of these things, but right now, when you look at each of these areas, the collective action is not that strong. Okay, so when we do the regression analysis, I'm not going to read you all of these numbers, but all of these types of capacity showed up positive and strong. And so when we interpret the findings, the results suggest that resilience capacity has a positive influence on household food security in the project area, that greater resilience capacity is associated with higher calorie consumption, higher dietary diversity, lower food insecurity overall, and less hunger. And what's also interesting is transformative capacity has a stronger impact than adaptive capacity, and adaptive capacity has a stronger impact than absorptive capacity. So you need all three of these. You don't need one, you need all three. So when we looked at the community resilience capacities, we were kind of disappointed. And as I said before, a lot of this had to do with the fact that the collective action activities are not as strong. This is something we're investigating in more detail in the qualitative work that we're currently doing, in the monitoring that we're doing. We want to know why that is, what's going on there. So when we look at community resilience, it doesn't appear to aid households in avoiding less extreme forms of food insecurity, but it did have a big impact on avoiding significant hunger. So community resilience didn't have a lot of effect on wasting either. So we believe then that the community resilience found is probably due to the fact the low community resilience is that the collective action activities are relatively low, are not very strong, and that's an important insight. So that tells you that some people are better at household resilience, weak on community resilience. And so in those areas where we're weak in community resilience, we really want to strengthen those things so that their ability to manage shocks and stresses is better. So the most important thing we were trying to determine was whether greater resilience capacity reduces the negative impacts of shocks and well-being outcomes. And so we did use the following regression. So it's the interaction terms between shock exposure, the measures of resilience capacity, and whether it has a positive impact on well-being outcomes. And so when we did these regressions, we found that it did have a positive impact. The results suggest that resilience capacity somehow alters the impact of shock exposure on households. The interaction terms are statistically significant for both HFIAS and HHS. The results suggest that shock exposure increases food insecurity, but is less so the higher the household's resilience capacity. So it has a mediating effect. This is what we hypothesized, and the results prove that it's true. This is consistent with the theory of resilience. In the prime area, resilience capacity shield households from the negative impacts of shocks. This is really illustrated by this chart. And those of you who may not be able to understand it, what we have along the bottom row is shock exposure index. Now what we have on the top here is household food insecurity access scale. So the higher, you can see that this is resilience capacity. So it's 3.8, 4.8, and 5.8. The higher the resilience capacity, the lower the slope is in terms of food security, no matter even as you increase shocks. This is an important finding. This means that the capacities actually do make a big difference in terms of managing shocks and stresses to enable us to have less food insecurity. So the resilience capacity mediated relationship between shock exposure and household food insecurity implied by the regression results is illustrated by that figure. It shows that the slope of the line is smaller, the higher is the level of resilience capacity. Further, any given level of shock, for example, 30 is associated with a lower level of food insecurity, the higher the resilience capacity. So it's the interactive effect of these three that's important to take into account. So what I want to say then is that the baseline survey indicates resilience appears to be higher in the Borana than in the Jijiga area, and it's higher among the pastoralists than the agro-pastoralists and the non-pastoralists. Why is that? Why do you think it's higher among the pastoralists? I want you to come back to that when we finish. Second, the baseline survey showed that all three groups of households are highly food insecure and vulnerable to multiple types of shocks and stresses. The poverty rate in this area was 57%. It's much higher than it is in other parts of Ethiopia. Household and community resilience needs to be strengthened to avoid further deprivation due to such disturbances. The project is really aimed at strengthening all three of those types of capacities. So we shall see whether they succeed. The PRIME project has been designed to strengthen these capacities. So the follow-up survey will be designed to capture changes in resilience capacity over the life of the project and evaluate the impact of the project on resilience capacities and well-being outcomes. So what are the next steps? Well, we've set up an interim monitoring system to capture real-time household and community responses to shocks and stresses that have occurred over the next 4 years. So the way the system was set up is that there were threshold indicators that had to indicate that a shock hit. And once that shock hit, that launched us to go in and do these surveys, okay? And so the surveys were focused on, like I said before, a subset of the households that were surveyed in the baseline. So there's about 430 households that we're tracking. And we want to see how they actually are doing in managing these shocks that they're exposed to. So we're collecting the data every month for 6 months, for over a 10-day period during that month. So we're asking questions about, how are they coping? What is the community doing about it? Are they losing assets? Are they able to manage it? Are they diversifying? What exactly are they up to? How are they managing this? So we're using both quantitative and qualitative data collection activities, and these are very short instruments. One of the things that people complain about in this survey was that it was 22 modules long. It was huge. I'm sure that Owen can attest that this is always the problem when the survey instruments are too big. So what we wanted to do was have data collection more often, smaller survey instruments, so that we could really track change as it was happening. So you don't overburden the household. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes to ask the questions, so that you can really find out what's really going on the ground. So we're going to be doing this year. We've already done 1 month. We're on the second month of data collection, and we're going to be doing it again next year. So hopefully, if the project is improving things, we should start seeing a positive effect next year and by the end line, if we made the right choices in terms of the design. Okay, I'm done. Thank you very much. One of the things that in work that we've done in previous years in Ethiopia was that we were trying to look at the relationship between household resilience and community resilience. And in fact, that's one of our research questions as part of this study. And what we found is that you can have households within a community that are resilient, but the community may not be resilient. Right, so just because you have household resilience in the community doesn't mean that the community is resilient. That's important to understand that. And so we're going to be using hierarchical linear modeling. I don't know if those of you who are involved in educational psychology know that this is a common approach that's used when you're trying to compare how students' performance is with regards to schools, within districts, within regions. you're looking at the interactive effect at these different levels. And so we want to know, what effect does community resilience have on household resilience, and what effect does household resilience then have on these outcomes of interest? And so our feeling is that we need to investigate the community resilience issue a little bit further to find out if we're missing something, or because people will talk about helping each other, and so of those 5 types of collective action I talked about, maybe 1 or 2 would be strong, but 3 would be bad. So maybe they help each other informally in terms of safety nets, but they're terrible at managing natural resources, or they're helping each other on disaster risk reduction, but they aren't managing their public goods very well. One or 2 of these things, all of which will have an influence on the long term. In other words, if they don't take care of their public goods, the roads deteriorate, the health clinic can't get staff to stay there because it's deteriorated, or the school can't get teachers to come because they haven't taken care of the schools. All of these are, and if you look at the qualitative information from our study, you can see that all of these were big issues for why human capital investments weren't happening in some of these places, because they just didn't have the public goods in place, or they weren't well taken care of. So I think we're going to be looking at this more closely and trying to understand this relationship between community resilience and household resilience.
I was wondering, just as a follow-up, if the number of households that were resilient increased, then would the community resilience, the number of areas that they could contribute to, increase?
Not necessarily. I don't think that's something that needs to be empirically proven. We don't know yet. Hopefully, if households are more resilient, then they'll be able to engage more in collective action, we hope, but that's not necessarily true.
Lady in purple.
Ruth Symes with PCI, Project Concern. I was interested in which components of the indices are the strongest predictors, and you had alluded to a short list of those components. I'd be very interested in knowing what's on that short list. Thank you.
You want me to let the cat out of the bag already?
Yes.
I'll have to look it up. I mean, I've got it on my computer here. I can let you know. We have everybody's name. I will send it all to you, I promise. But social capital was one that was really important. It stood out as extremely important across all 3 capacities. But I can't remember all the other ones. I have to go back and open it up. Let me look. Yeah, I could maybe. Thanks, Ann, for making my life difficult. Is it? That one is all the things on there. Yeah, I should be able to tell from this. The social capital definitely was important. So was the ability to recover from shocks. This availability of disaster preparedness mitigation, and the asset ownership. Those were the 4 for this one. Again, social capital, asset ownership, and this aspiration one. Is that 4 or 3? Huh? And I think the human capital went on this one. I have to go back. I should have had it. Huh? Yeah.
I mean, I sent it to you. I think the important thing here is this is, as Tim mentioned, volume 1 and 2 in terms of the length of the survey and the result. And so we don't want to be in a position where we're replicating that everywhere. So the principle is we can cut down on the number of indicators within these indices by looking at the covariance between indicators. I would caution we don't want to take whatever was applicable in the case of pastoral Ethiopia and apply it writ large we still need to do more testing about how these play out in different cases. So we'll continue to do that as we build our cases, but I think it is the principle is right. How can we pare down so in the next round we can have a limited set? But yeah.
You don't have your computer right there. Pull it up.
We have a question from online.
Online. So the first one is, will any data research continue after the project is closed to understand how households cope after support is no longer immediately available?
Greg? Jim?
I think it is true that Food for Peace did a very interesting study looking at exit strategies that went back years later and looked at projects and actually some very sort of counterintuitive findings in terms of impact at end of project versus impact 3, 4, 5 years down the line. So I think it's definitely a possibility. I don't think we've specifically thought about it at this point, but there's no reason we're doing these surveys. In this case, we've got a baseline and end line in this routine monitoring that we couldn't again go back later. So it's set up in a way that would allow us to do that.
Yeah, we got 3 questions, so this is the second one. Do you know how intra-household dynamics affect resilience and food security?
That's a good question. We're investigating that in the qualitative work right now. We're trying to understand power relationship dynamics within the household and how that affects people managing the shock. So we do have some of that information in the baseline report too. Women talk about the strategies that they have and what they are prevented from doing, and you know, some of the women actually say that when men migrate, they actually have more opportunity than they did before to actually manage the shocks and stresses more effectively. So, you know, as anything, when you have a shock, it can create new opportunities for people that they didn't have before. But some work that, John, we did in Somalia, you want to talk a little bit about that, about the women?
Tim, thanks for putting me on the spot. I'm John Kurtz with Mercy Corps. So it's I think an area for further exploration, but we certainly have taken similar data sets and looked at just women's decision making among a range of household decisions and how that affects some of these outcomes. We have plans to try to do that with some of the prime impact evaluation data as well, to try to test some theories around gender and resilience. In Somalia, yeah, that's the way it was pointing to. So we're trying to verify that across other spots in the region. Thanks.
We had a question right here first.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I'm Meredith Sewell with USAID's Bureau for Food Security. I wondered when you talked about aspirations, if you could get any information out of your data and the surveys about what the people viewed themselves as, what would be improvements in their lives, say a year from now or further out, you know, beyond what you talked about in terms of the lack of fatalism, or, you know, and then how would that be associated perhaps with the things that we're measuring, the things that we're looking for in terms of outcomes of well-being? Just wondered if you'd looked at that and what you found.
Well, again, if you look at the qualitative data that we do have in the write-up of the baseline, you'll see where women will be talking about what they perceive would make them more resilient in the future, and a lot of it has to do with having enough assets and livestock to be able to manage shocks in the future more effectively, being able to diversify their income sources. So they talk about getting more engaged in petty trading in certain places that allow them not to be exposed to the same kinds of shocks.
Just to follow up, I didn't actually wasn't asking about what they thought would make them more resilient, although that was interesting, but what they thought would be an improvement in their life. So we're measuring their improvements in food security, diet diversity, what the things you talked about. Did you get any sense of what they thought would be an improvement in their life?
Better access to food when they need it on a seasonal basis so that they're not negatively affected by these droughts all the time. The drought was a big issue for them, and it had a huge effect on being able to grow crops. It had a huge effect on the death of livestock because they could easily see that when drought hit, the animal diseases went up and say they'd lose more animals. They also saw the conflict going up because of competition for pasture and water resources. And when water's not available, they have to travel even further to get access to the water, which exposes them to all kinds of negative things as well. So all of those things they would like to see improved, like better access to water, better management of these pastures, better diversification of income sources so that they can manage these things more effectively. But there are some constraints. You know, women were limited in terms of the kinds of activities they could engage in that prevented them from being able to diversify like they would like to. Less so in Borana than in Somalia, though.
Well, thank you. Hi, Brian Greenberg, Interaction.
Hi, Brian.
Very impressive presentation, comprehensive, and I look forward to digging into some of this material a little deeper. One of the findings that was especially interesting to me was the apparent sense that of the three kinds of capacities, transformative capacity was the most important, and then adaptive and absorptive probably the least so. Wondering if you can give us some sense of the magnitude of the difference in the relationship between those, and if one of the takeaway messages for donors and implementers isn't that investments in transformative capacity and the kinds of things that you clustered in that aren't among the most important to address, and that they make possible gains and ensure the sustainability of gains in the other two domains. And if that's not the case, if you could just sharpen for me what that hierarchical relationship means in terms of programming.
Yeah, I think what's important is that to enable households to at least have a fighting chance to manage shocks and stresses effectively, if you don't have the enabling conditions in place, you don't have access to markets, you don't have good governance, you don't have proper policies in place, you don't have social service delivery that's happening so that the opportunity cost for putting your kid in school or putting your wife in a clinic is too high, then it's going to be very difficult to achieve adaptive and absorptive capacity. But even if you put those enabling conditions in place, you still have a big variety of households out there that don't necessarily are still not able to manage shocks and stresses effectively because they don't have the human capital or the assets or the skill levels or the social capital that are necessary to do that effectively. So you still, even if you build transformative capacity, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition to achieve resilience. I think you need to have all three of those, even though the transformative capacity can have such a huge effect because it's a systems change. It's affecting everybody, but the absorptive and adaptive is just as critical. And I think one of the problems when we approached resilience in the past is we tended to first come at it from absorptive capacity. Then when the climate change stuff became important, we started focusing on adaptive capacity. And only more recently we're seeing that you need to have all three. And the other thing that's important here is that by looking at these capacities as our focus, rather than emergency humanitarian assistance versus development assistance, it gives us a playing field that both of those groups can work together on. Okay, so somebody that normally engages with OFTA or Emergency Food for Peace sees a role for it to play in these different kinds of capacities. The guys that normally are involved in development type activities see a role for themselves in building these capacities. So it's not like this is mine and that's yours and we keep these things divided. It's actually we work together on all three of these. And so I think that these joint planning cells that AID has been trying to push is trying to break down those barriers, and focusing on these types of capacities actually allows a better way for them to interact. I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, I'll probably leave the joint planning cell things to the side for a moment, but we are trying to bring humanitarian development sides together. What's actually really fascinating for me here As you look at these indicators that are included in resilience capacity measures, some of them are related to technical interventions, which as donors, as NGOs, we've become very good at implementing technical interventions. But some of them clearly fall outside of that and are more sort of adaptive solution sets around social capital and other things. And so I think from a programmatic standpoint, and again, sort of building on what you were saying about what do we take away programmatically, how do we begin to actually invest in the types of things that matter, even if they aren't in our sort of technical sector comfort zone? And I think that that's a huge area that we have yet to really fully unpack. I know that in another study in Ethiopia, we looked at the impact of a women's milk cooperative. And there was an increase in income. There were another positive classic outcome measures, but the women, when asked, somewhat to mirror this point, what was the most important outcome of this project, they pointed to, it had linked them to women that they weren't previously linked to, and they were able to lean on those women during times of stress. So I think really not stumbling into those types of good outcomes, but actually investing in them intentionally is a big area that this type of survey work points to.
It also, just another comment, it points to the importance of interdisciplinary working together, you know. So it's not just agronomists and economists or sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, all need to be engaged somehow. Yeah.
I have a quick comment on what you just said about the social capital and the linking, but then I have a more technical question. But I think in Food for Peace's current strategy, they have a very specific intermediate result that is strengthening capacities, ability to affect the factors that affect their food security, which I have always thought very much to be focused on the linking part of it and the ability to speak to local government and local governance to affect those factors. So I think to a certain extent, at least conceptually, in their current strategy, Food for Peace has been trying to do that. How effectively and through what approaches, I don't know, but just a comment in that respect. But I have a question about the transformative capacity, which is part of your household level resilience, right? And you're using a community fixed effects model, and you're including community of residents in your model, and almost all of your transformative capacities are things that, you, as you said, you would measure through the community survey, so they don't vary that much among households in a given community. And I found it curious that then it came out so very significant in your regression analysis. And I'm sure I'm just missing something, but I wanted to ask that.
So when we're looking at transformative capacity, we're trying to hold for all those other factors that we don't really use a community fixed effects for transformative capacity. We hold for all those other factors that I mentioned that we're holding for. If this is primarily derived from the community, that's not what we're using for that one. Yeah.
Household characteristics and community of residence. And community of residence, to me, would be so determinant in determining that particular of a household resilience capacity.
Okay. Well, I'll need to go back and look and make sure that that's not the case, but I'm pretty sure we took that into account when we ran it. I'll have to ask Lisa.
Tim, we have a question there, and then we're going to take a couple online.
I'm not that smart.
Hi, my name is Jenny Conniff, and I am the Livelihood Advisor for FuseNet. Chris Hilbrunner has done some work with resilience that took a different approach. Basically, it used more the disaster risk reduction definition of vulnerability as a foundation for understanding resilience, that one must be resilient to a specific shock. The way that you've done this analysis by grouping all of the shocks together into one index means that we don't have an appreciation for the relative frequency of different types of shocks, the relative severity of those. So I'm particularly interested in whether or not you intend to do some reanalysis to identify the most frequent or most significant shocks. And then also, perhaps if that were done, perhaps there might be a different set or different priorities of the most important factors relevant to the capacities you're trying to measure with respect to certain specific shocks. And that might be very relevant to decision makers when they're trying to intervene in specific geographic areas.
I guess one thing I didn't understand, we were interested in the shocks that people experienced in the last year, not over the last 5 years, but the last year. And then we were also looking at the severity of those shocks, whether or not they saw them as really important and had a huge effect or not. So I think we have taken that into account. I don't understand your question.
But if, for example, you have a list of 18 shocks, perhaps a household says that they experienced 2 or 3 of those 18 in the past year.
Right.
So our work suggests that resilience varies based on the type of shock.
Sure.
Not just its severity, but also its type. And so it would be interesting to be able to disaggregate not just by the capacities themselves in relation to the sum of the shocks, but by each type of shock to be able to understand then the capacities that are relevant to each type of shock.
Right. No, I wouldn't disagree with that, and I guess we can look at that analysis broken out by shock, but my experience is that almost every household that in this area is exposed to multiple shocks. And so only focusing on 1 or 2 shocks and trying to determine what the effect of that one is may mask what the overall effect of the combination of the shocks are. You know, people are experiencing both collective shocks and idiosyncratic shocks. And so, in fact, 90% of the shocks that they're experiencing tend to be more idiosyncratic than collective, although most of our work has tended to focus more on the collective shocks, like big droughts or but work by various groups have shown that if you have a lot of these extensive shocks that are affecting people constantly, those are the ones that we should be focusing on. But we tend to wait till the big collective shock comes, like the one in 2011, before we actually pour resources into even focus on resilience. My feeling is that we can do that disaggregated analysis, but reality is for most households, they're exposed to multiple shocks at the same time.
Okay, so 2 questions online. The first one, where does the social capital reside within households? Is it the heads of households, and do men and women tap into different networks?
They tap into different networks. I think that's the right answer.
Okay, very simply. Next question. Next question is, does the Index for Transformative Capacity include measures of governance? And are there other indices of governance or measures of marginalization or inequality included to ensure measures of transformative capacity go beyond access to resources and social safety nets?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that one up. That's a tricky one to get at, especially in Ethiopia. When you start asking about governance, your NGO can get thrown out of the country. So you have to be careful about that. And so we try to use proxies for that, actually. And that has more to do with whether people are satisfied with the kind of services they're getting access to, whether they feel that the quality of those services is any good. But we aren't asking whether they feel like certain groups are getting favors versus others, because that's dangerous stuff, especially in the Somali region of Ethiopia.
Hi, Kyla Gregory, Food for Peace. I wanted to find out if the results of this baseline were going to feed into the project design, possibly the implementation or the interventions now are going to focus more on the social capital or the human capital.
John, you want to answer that one?
I had a similar question about use. So, you know, as a lead implementer, Mercy Corps is a key audience for this. The plan is actually to present some of the findings to the team there in January. Tim will come out, so we'll dig into the implications then, and think about potential redesigns that also don't throw the impact evaluation off. As of now, I don't think that we've digested them enough to be able to say, yes, the market work we're doing needs to adjust in these ways to support these types of capacities. But I guess to further the question, maybe back to Greg or others, what do you see? I mean, one of the brilliant things about this is the impact evaluation wasn't trying to necessarily say, who's more resilient. It was trying to understand what is it that's really associated with greater food security. So it has a lot of diagnostic value. In that case, Greg, you started hinting at potential uses amongst Feed the Future, maybe Food for Peace, the Ethiopian mission, perhaps. I'm curious of what you all do next with this, given that value.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things. One, in this resilient space, I think we're very and acutely aware that we don't actually know what the right set of interventions and investments are, and that we have a commitment to what USAID calls collaborate, learn, and adapt. This is certainly a piece of it. This is not the totality of it. We have additional investments in a regional resilience learning program. We're also working with a broader set of partners through the Global Alliance to try and bring this set of learnings together. And absolutely, yes, this will inform programming. And the expectation, I think I actually said this in our workshop in Niger, if these projects look exactly as they do 2 years from now, we have failed, because we know that we weren't going to have everything exactly right at the sort of solicitation and proposal stage. That makes the impact evaluation a little bit challenging, but we certainly aren't going to hold projects static for the sake of Tim's resume. I think the other thing I want to mention, and maybe Ann could speak to this or speak to others, is that something along these lines we've been doing with the WEA, the Women's Empowerment and Agriculture Index, really looking at, okay, it's great to have these descriptive baseline values, but how are we actually using this as a diagnostic and feeding into program design? There's been some work on the Women's Empowerment Index on this front to actually sort of generate guidance on how to apply this. So I think we want to build on that, but absolutely in an individual case. The other thing is, this is a survey that took place in an area where Prime is intervening. Its findings and relevance are not limited to Prime. There are other actors in that space, both USAID and others, and this is a population-based survey. It may have been tailored to specific Prime questions. So for the Ethiopian team, and when Tim goes out and presents that work, we actually want to start a broader conversation about how we bring these findings to bear.
Hi, Mike Colby with Bureau for Food Security. I want to bring it back to your findings. You keep mentioning diversity of livelihoods is important, but in your findings you said it was the pure pastoralists that were more resilient. Could you explore that a little bit more? In your findings you said the pure pastoralists were the most resilient, but you keep mentioning diversity of livelihoods is important, so why did it come
Actually,
up?
the pastoralists had the most diversified livelihoods too. They were not only were they were more resilient because they could be more mobile and they were able to go to pasture and water resources, but they also had members that would spin off and take other jobs to send back remittances and things like that. So they were the most resilient of the bunch in terms of diversifying livelihoods, being able to have mobility to really get out of a drought situation if they needed to. They tended to have more animals, so they were able to sell off animals to manage the food insecurity problems more effectively. So they were resilient on a number of fronts. They were stronger social capital, all three types. So when people say, well, pastoralists are a dying breed and not really somebody you should invest in, well, that's not what our data says. Our data says they were the least resilient were the non-pastoralists that had dropped out. Yeah.
Mara Russell with CARE, but I actually wanted to ask more about that because in terms of some of the work that's been done on pastoralists transitioning out of pastoralism, quite often it's those folks who have not done a good job of adapting or
have, where their land has been encroached on, with other types of development initiatives, et cetera, the grazing areas and so forth, meaning that they have to travel much further away from their homes, et cetera. So I would imagine that people who are actually adapting well with pastoralism had figured out some way to do that, to overcome those issues. I guess the question from my standpoint is, and maybe this is a broader question that you'll be looking at overall, I don't know if you are, but what would be the mitigating factors that would make it easier for pastoralists, to be positive deviant, to adapt better? Is it just simply figuring out alternative livelihoods, or are there other ways, like maintaining a very strong social capital or other things? What are those mitigating factors? Are you going to be looking at that overall?
Yep. No, what we're interested in is there's a range of interventions, probably too many, that are in this project, but they're touching on all of these different points, and so we're going to be looking at the effects of these different interventions on predicting these outcomes. So hopefully by the end line, maybe sooner, but at least by the end line, we would have a pretty good idea which things seem to be, which kinds of investments brought about greater resilience improvements than others. That's what we hope anyway. Of course, major war could break out.
Yeah, this is Modunaki from CRS. I was just wondering if how much of each of the indices that you created, how much of each one of them should the household have to be called resilient? Or like, can you do that? If you can't.
I guess are you saying that there's threshold? What are the thresholds for each of these?
No, the indices that you develop. You develop about 3 indices. Yeah. Yes. And how much each one of these indices a household should have to be called resilient? Or you can't do that? Or if you can't, like, why?
I don't know. That's a good question. We'll get back to you. I think what you have to realize, we were surprised that the indices actually worked. So that was a major breakthrough for us in the first place, because it was all hypothetical, theoretical discussion. But in fact, when we also recognized that when we were collecting the data, this is a very fast-moving field. So when we designed these instruments in August 2013, if we were to design those instruments today, we would do many of them slightly differently, because we realized we could have asked the questions slightly differently and we would have got a better answer. So, and that's just the nature of research. You hopefully get better through time. At least I know I don't, because I'm getting too old now, but you get better through time. But the point is that, so for example, when Greg came out to Tucson and we went through every indicator detail by detail and figured out where ones could be tweaked to make them better, which ones could be dropped that weren't that useful, and that's, you kind of have to do this very comprehensive approach to figure out what you need to narrow down to. And so you need to think about our initial stab at this is very exploratory. It was our best attempt at the time. We know we can do better next time, and that's what you hope for, is that we're going to get better as we go. But I think it's one of the few real examples out there that we have of measuring these capacities, and it shows promise. So much so that EFOD's already adopted this approach and is incorporating it into their work. We're starting to see it being adopted by other agencies as well. So I think what we want to do is we want to see a lot of testing of this stuff, and as we test it, we'll get better at it. I think
To answer the threshold question a little bit more directly, I think what we're really interested in here is not setting a threshold for resilient, not resilient, but looking at degree of resilience in relation to well-being outcomes of interest, some of which have established thresholds, poverty, wasting, stunting. And it came up earlier. I just want to throw another bit of information in for the use of wasting as a nutritional indicator. Everywhere that USAID is engaged in these focused resilience efforts, there is a distinct nutritional feature of those places, and that is elevated wasting or global acute malnutrition rates even during good seasons and good years. So here we see 14% in northern Kenya, between 18 and 22%, in Niger around 15%. It's a little bit apples and oranges when comparing with stunting, but the big thing about wasting, well, two big things. One, it's got a very high association with mortality. Two, it's reversible. And so it's this very sensitive measure of sort of change over time that is actually one of the top line indicators that USAID uses for its collective efforts on resilience. Depth of poverty, household hunger score, wasting or global acute malnutrition, and then a little bit of a politically expedient measure, reduction in humanitarian assistance needs, controlling for severity of shock and stress, et cetera.
I have those 4 indicators now. I found mine. So on absorptive capacity, what we were able to narrow it down from 7 to 4 was access to informal safety nets. Access to informal safety nets, the availability of disaster preparedness and mitigation programs, availability of hazard insurance, and bonding social capital. And those 4 basically have a, let me see, 97% correlation. So we dropped 3 and we still didn't lose anything. Okay, on the next one, adaptive capacity, exposure to information, human capital, bridging social capital, and linking social capital. So linking and bridging were really highly important. And again, our Pearson's rank correlation was 95%. For transformative capacity, availability of formal safety nets, access to basic services, bridging and linking social capital, 99%. So I guess the bottom line for here, and I caution you to not just chop everything and leave the rest of them out, because what's critical here is that this is one context, and all of these indicators might be more important in another context. So, but there are going to be ways that we can narrow it down, at least in this area, and get similar results. And so, and that's what we should be trying to do, is figure out how to be more parsimonious in what we ask about. Yeah.
My name is Mike Martin from the Bureau of Food Security. I think you may have just answered my question. I think all of these social and human capital factors are extremely important in all economic behavior, but certainly in resilience. But it comes down to how are you going to be able to quantify one thing, and how are you going to be able to measure these correlations? Because there is, when you're looking at regressions like that, it's been a while since I've had statistics, but you have a lot of correlation between your independent variables.
So one of the things that when we were constructing these indices is that we're using principal components analysis to do that, and we know that some of the variables are yes/no type questions. Some are more ordinal. So you use polycaloric approaches to principal components to address that problem. And so if you look carefully at the report, you'll see that when we're constructing these indices, we're very, very careful about how we actually analyze these and choose which ones are in there. And then once we've got those correct, then that we use those in the regressions. Okay. You have a question?
Yeah, I think you did answer my question earlier, but I was just wondering, based on we talked about the social capital and the 3 types of social capital. And my question was just looking at which one were the most important, but it seems like it's bridging and linking. But I was just curious specifically what within bridging and linking are the type of social capital that people are adapting to in that region. For example, perhaps I'm not sure, but I'm just assuming perhaps it's remittances, or I'm just very curious on what it is that NGOs can be able to build upon.
What, what types of, how do you strengthen bridging and linking social capital?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that those two are coming up a lot. But it's just good to know what specifically are the types of those social capitals, and how can you link those?
Well, there's a module in the questionnaire. Again, you'll have access to these questionnaires, so you can see how we ask these questions. But there's a whole series of questions trying to find out whether households have relationships with other households or communities outside of their community that they can rely on for different things, or they have a relationship with some power structure, whether it be government or NGOs or even the private sector, that they can pull on when they need it to help to recover. So, and there's a whole series of questions around that. So we're actually building an index around each of these. So any one question is not going to get at it. You have to, and a lot of the work that's been done by IFPRI on this is what we're building on, and the work that's been done by Dan Aldridge we're building on as well. So, you know, a lot of this locus of control is what psychologists refer to this stuff, and so there's been a lot of really good work in the social psychology on looking at these issues, and so there's measurements from those areas that we should be also trying to bring in, and we thank Tiffany Griffiths for pointing that out to us, who used to be with the Bureau of Food for Peace. Right, Greg?
You mentioned qualitatively that water came up significantly, and the lack of water, but access to communal natural resources wasn't one of the key transformative capacities. So is that not actually a very good indicator of resilience?
That's a good question. I'll have to think about that one. I think it was one of the things you want to capture when you're doing these surveys is not only information around capacities, but information around vulnerabilities. And so we have a lot of questions to try to capture what those key constraints are in terms of natural resources in the modules. Okay, so like I said, we were already at 129 pages of analysis, so we were kind of, we could mine that data pretty significantly.
But was water not considered a basic service?
Yeah. That is actually, access to services is several variables together. Yeah. So each one of these, even though it looks like a one indicator, several of these are multiple.
Tim, I think it's also worth adding, just because it didn't appear amongst the four doesn't mean it's not important. What it means is that it co-varies with one of the others. So it could have just co-varied with social capital, so the addition of this adds no more new information. And so it's not a sort of substantive judgment of value, it's a statistical judgment of additive predictive value.
The economist that was working with me on this was kind of against trying to cut it down like this. I made her do it, but yeah, I think, you know, what's important is, you know, there's a lot of stuff we'd like to know, but it ends up being a 3-hour questionnaire, and then you start to lose what's the word, Owen? You lose credibility with the households because they are tired of you asking questions, and so your measurement error goes up dramatically. And so we're always trying to strike a balance between what you can ask reasonably and what you need to be able to make the right conclusions on what's going on. And there's always a tug of war between people saying, you need this indicator in there, you need that indicator in there. And then when you add up all the indicators, we're struggling with this right now in Niger. When you add up all the indicators, it becomes unmanageable for the survey. So, we're not going to get it right every time, but we're going to get close. So that's the most important thing.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Back here in the back.
Hi, I'm Tracy Powell in the Bureau of Food Security. Thank you for the presentation. This is a really interesting tool that you've developed, and my question is about how you're applying it to the PRIME project. It looks like the way that you've structured your sampling, you're going to be able to capture areas with high intervention impact and areas with low or no intervention impact. And here I'm going to reveal my lack of knowledge about the PRIME program, but I assume that you're actually testing a variety of different interventions. So my question is, how is the project structuring those interventions across the communities, and will that allow you to capture the relative value of different types of interventions with your impact assessment?
Yeah, we realize that this is a very complicated project and it has a lot of interventions, but the ones that we were particularly interested in were the ones that were strengthening push-pull activities. And so we were looking at, any kinds of market improvements for livestock, any kinds of natural resource management improvements, and any kinds of productive improvements, things that if you see a lot of concentration of those activities, because the nutrition activities were being implemented across all the communities, so we figured we would capture that anyway, but it was these push-pull activities that we're really interested in and seeing if they made a difference, because that was the major hypothesis of AID, was that if they do the combination push-pull activities, they should see greater resilience. And so we want to see if that's true.
So I'm sorry, so are there different combinations of those activities being implemented in the different communities, and you'll track that? Okay, great, thanks.
So in places where you had at least more than 9 types of interventions, those would be in the high intensity. Much fewer than 9, like 3 or 4, those would be the low intensity kind of interventions. No, because, that's not true. In some of those villages, they're randomly chosen in those regions. So, there's not just project villages, but we wanted to choose areas where there was going to be high concentration and low concentration of the project. There's a lot of other things going on in this region. Other projects are happening, and we can't always control for all of those things, but we're trying to take them into account. Well, even in this survey, when you look at the results, you'll see people talking about other kinds of activities going on by NGOs or by a government that have nothing to do with the PRIME project, but they're still happening. We're any of these impact evaluations, you don't have a clean, clear experimental design every time. That's why I call it quasi-experimental.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Greg, for this very illuminating presentation. And I think I reflect many people's comments here saying it's a great way to start in terms of trying to get to where we find something we can use and translate into our programming. And also, I think it's wise to keep in mind that these work perhaps differently, different combinations in different settings. That's why it's so important, I think, to look at results of this kind of activity and to compare it to other kinds of outcomes. In any case, we really do appreciate all the participation, both here and online, and to remind you that a lot of this, Patrick, this is going to be on fsnnetwork.org. That is the PowerPoint. What else will we have on the network? Okay, the PRIME reports will be a link to have links that you can reach to the TOPS fsnnetwork.org website. And we'll be trying to provide opportunities to share further information from this and other studies as TOPS moves forward. So thank you so much for coming.